Hi, my name's Cordy, and I've got a discount code in the description for my many hats, obviously. So I was asked on YouTube in a couple of places, I think yesterday, about practice drills or things that I practice or things that I think people should practice or whatever. So today is Wednesday, and that's when I talk about what I'm working on and things that I practice, so I think maybe it makes sense to do it today and talk about what I practiced in the past. I guess I'll caveat this by saying that I'm a self-taught guitarist, so I'm not sure that much of what I say is necessarily that useful, and perhaps what I did took me longer to get to where I am today than it would take someone who actually had lessons. So I think maybe that's worth saying, but I guess if you like my playing and what I do, then maybe some of this would be useful for you. In terms of the history, I picked up a guitar when I was 4, I think, but I made a little dent on the bottom of it, so my dad didn't let me play that guitar anymore. The guitar happened to be a Yamaha. So on my 8th birthday, I was given like a 3/4 size classical guitar, and I learned a D chord on the first day. It was a Sunday, and a G chord. So my dad taught me like these open chords on 3 strings, and I guess for most people that's like the first few years of their learning is kind of chord playing and all that sort of stuff. And I was interested in, or going to church at the time as a kid. I think I would try and play the tunes that they played in church, so I'd get like the same music they'd use where it had the words and chords written above it, as I'm sure you've seen. So that was kind of my playing around that kind of that sort of stuff. Alongside this, I was having piano lessons, by the way, so I think that's where a lot of the music theory and all that stuff came along with it, luckily. One of the first things I can remember doing on guitar is learning to play by ear from Thin Lizzy Live and Dangerous. I can remember sort of sitting with a cassette player and rewinding back bits of Emerald and stuff. Etc. That sort of thing, and learning those tunes and playing along with them, playing along with the melodies, and sort of learning to play Gary Moore solos and things. But all of that was by ear. I don't think it was until someone asked if I could play the Stairway to Heaven solo that I'd actually seen a tab. And then there's a phase where I was going through like Iron Maiden and Dream Theater tab books. So in terms of what I actually practiced, the first thing that I can remember consciously practicing with a metronome, but actually a keyboard drum machine, was just running through the scale in legato fashion up and down, and trying to get that as physically fast as I could possibly go in all positions. And that was basically the extent of my practice, so getting from A to B. So that took up quite a chunk of my time, just trying to do that, but in all keys, I guess. So whilst that's kind of not necessarily all that musically useful and not something that I would use a terrible amount at the moment, it does give me like a visual kind of bedrock for the major scale all across the neck. So I think that was kind of the use of doing that. So that sort of thing, I guess, could be useful if you were trying to build up speed and technique and stuff, potentially, if you wanted to focus on that. But the focus for me at the time was very much speed, but I can see now that it was also building up like a visual and physical knowledge of what those major scale positions felt like and looked like. So I guess it was good from that respect. It's not necessarily something that I'd encourage you to work loads on, although if you're trying to learn 3-note per string scales, which I think personally are useful, then I think that's a good way to do it. Instead of just, focusing on one position at a time, try and join them up, or that could be the goal. And then I think from the Dream Theatre side of things, I did get in and see some of the John Petrucci rock discipline, which is where I wanted to talk about some of these exercises that I don't necessarily think sound too much like music. So I'd encourage you, when you're finding things to practice, to find things that maybe sound like music, because I have this feeling that what we practice is what actually comes out in our playing. So you get these sorts of things. But beyond the realms of that exercise, I don't find those useful in a musical context. So, you could do this kind of thing, which from a technical point of view, that kind of thing might be useful, and it's maybe a kind of okay warm-up. But I think in terms of actual musical value, there's never a time in a song where you could realistically play that and it wouldn't sound like a certain word. For me, I wouldn't necessarily recommend too much of that kind of thing. I think there's a Frank Gambale chop builder or something like that, which does actually have quite a lot of useful stuff in it. You're practicing things that sound musical and are diatonically, Frank Gambale's chop builder I actually would sort of recommend if you're looking to go down that route of building kind of solid alternate picking and that sort of stuff, because it's actually made up of kind of musical sounding examples rather than chromatic or kind of geometric stuff, which I think, whilst technically useful, if it has no real musical use, to me, I wouldn't bother practicing it too much. I guess the real focus of a lot of my playing has been about playing music all along, so for me, I think that's something that's important to try and do as quickly as possible. And I guess this is also the reason that if I was practicing like an alternate picking idea, or if I'm practicing licks, or if I'm practicing whatever it is, I'm quickly trying to get it into a musical context. And this isn't something that's unique to me. You'll hear lots of people talking about this stuff. As long as something remains just an exercise, I don't think it necessarily will come into your playing or crop up until you've started to kind of hear it in context. So, for instance, if you were playing, I don't know, something like that kind of idea. So you've been working on this little fragment of a major scale pentatonic type thing. As long as you're only playing it kind of out of context, I don't think that's necessarily going to creep into your playing if you start to apply it in tunes that you're already playing, or if you're playing with backing tracks and stuff, whatever speed you're playing at, as long as you're playing it in a musical context, I think there's more likelihood that it will start to creep into your playing, whether that's improvised or not. Your improvised playing is basically going to be made up of concepts and ideas that you practice. So I guess it's about practicing ideas that sound interesting to you. So this is why my practice these days would be more focused on things like playing entire shapes through the major scale. So these days, if I'm practicing something that's more likely to be more like this sort of thing, where I'm practicing a thing through the entire scale. So for instance, I've talked about this before. There are things that you might hear a saxophone player playing as well that I think are worth practicing. So there's that kind of stuff, which maybe if you want me to write out, I can do for you. Stuff that's very much sounding musical but still practicing a scale. I did this sort of thing on the pentatonics as well. So the other thing that I think I would practice is, if you're doing your 3-note per string stuff, practice doing things in a less obvious order. So the most obvious thing would be what would be less obvious might be, and then what would still be even more less obvious would be things like or and I don't necessarily think I would have been able to play any of that particularly fast, but I think it's potentially more useful to be able to do lots of different permutations than it is to be able to do one super fast. So that's, I think, what I would practice now if I was if I was given the choice. I think that sort of thing might be more useful for me to practice now than just running straight up or down the scale, working permutations and things that cause your fingers to move in different directions. So, and then things like arpeggios, I guess I spent time practicing sweep picking and that sort of stuff. In retrospect, I wouldn't recommend that, but what I would recommend is figuring out the triad stuff. So that's C major all around the neck. Work on being able to string that stuff together. And also major 7 arpeggios. And all the different types of arpeggios. I say all the different types, what I really mean is your core ones, so you like your major 7, your minor 7, diminished to some extent is useful, augmented is also can be useful, and that's basically where some of those ideas that you hear come from, hopefully. Then things like moving bigger shapes through the major scale, that's something that I wish I'd practiced more of when I was younger. Those are some of the things that I think I should have practiced and that I think it's useful to practice. You know, moving one arpeggio shape, particularly through a jazz standard, is super useful. So, you know, you could do like, what would we say if we just say root position. Even that is a super powerful kind of thing to practice. That's sort of a way that I think is worth practicing arpeggios. So I guess the gist of all of what I'm saying is that as soon as you're able to execute the idea that you're practicing, put it in a musical context. Now, I'm not particularly one of these people that would have said, you know, I'll practice scales for 20 minutes a day, then I'll practice arpeggios, and then I'll practice whatever. But I think that might be useful for some people. You know, or maybe you'll practice chords and new chords. For some amount of the day, but I think maybe it's useful to think about having some work on scales, having some work on arpeggios, having some work on technique, having some work on chords, doing some of that on a daily basis. But I also think it's worth thinking about stuff that's going to help your ear. So that might just mean I think this is something I definitely did every single day, some amount of free kind of play where you're just improvising and just playing along with some piece of music. I think for me that's been a really core part of what I practice and what I like to do. And then also I'm a kind of a big believer in letting what your interests are dictate what your practice is. So, you know, I could say to you, practice all of the modes or whatever, you know, practice augmented chords all through the circle of fifths, but it's not going to matter if you're playing punk, or, you know, it's not going to matter if you're gearing up to do a wedding season. I think it makes sense to practice what it makes sense for you to practice is. For most of us, we're always going to be using the major scale and pentatonics, so I think probably there's some amount of that everyone should practice. The other stuff, you know, talking about modes or altered scales, I think is something probably that you'll know if it's something that you're going to want to practice, because you'll be hearing it in the music that you're listening to, potentially. So, you know, if you find that you're listening to a lot of jazz, or you're listening to a lot of something that's got a lot of different stuff to what you're practicing, then that's going to be then what fuels your practice routine. The other major piece of kind of advice I give you is that if you're practicing a certain technique, I think it's important for you to kind of write something around that technique. So back in the day when I was super interested in alternate picking, I would write these kind of pieces of music to practice that. So I think in the classical world these are things called etudes or etudes, and it's really about writing something musical that can enable you to practice that technical aspect of your instrument. So that's basically, I think, a good way to approach stuff. So if you're practicing, you know, arpeggios and stuff, apply them to music instantly, or as soon as you can, so that you then have like a musical context for what it is that you're trying to achieve. Whether that's alternate picking, sweep picking, trying to get a chord voicing. Or whether that's trying to work out how a certain key change or harmonic movement works, just try and start to apply it as soon as you can, is what I find works for me. So those are just some of my ideas. Perhaps I'll put up a few of these kind of exercise concepts on Patreon if you want. Hopefully there's something sort of useful in there. This is basically how I practiced. You know, there was a lot of time early on spent with a metronome just doing that sort of stuff, but there was also a lot of time where I was just listening to music and trying to play that music. Basically the real gist of it is let what music you're listening to dictate what it is that you're going to practice. Yes, for most of that will mean that you're going to need to have a grasp of the major scale, and constantly developing that knowledge of the major scale and the visual aspect of it will help with whatever kind of music, but let the music dictate what it is that you practice. Hopefully that was helpful. If there was anything useful in here, there's a buy me a coffee link if you wanted to support the channel and me in some way, but only use that if you got something useful out of this and if you wanted to support me. Otherwise there's a Patreon, and if you want to like and subscribe, that'd be really cool if you got something useful out of this. In the comments below you could leave things that you found helpful so that other people can see them, and you know, if there's particular YouTube channels that people should check out, or if there's particular books that you've read that you find useful, then share in the comments. I think it might help people to see what it is that you found useful. As I say, this is sort of my own little journey. I'm just one guitarist who was self-taught, so I'm not saying that any of this is particularly gospel, but maybe it's useful. Cheers.